great intellectual centers of the world, and I've admired so much of the scholarship that's come out of these hallowed walls, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you both for the introductions, and you stated my thesis so admirably. I feel like I should simply sit down and let the discussion begin. But since I'm standing up, and since I'm a professor, I'll take the opportunity to talk. I want to start with a personal story. Some 2 weeks ago, I teach at the University of California at Santa Barbara, but my wife and I live out in the desert, in part for her health. So I made a special point to go back and be with her on Tuesday evening, because we wanted to be together as the election returns came in. We wanted to be together to celebrate, because after all of the polls indicated very clearly that Hillary Clinton was not only going to win, but win in a rather large way. So for us, the issue was not who was going to win the presidency, it was whether there would be sufficient momentum to have a strong support particularly in the Senate, for her to carry out the kind of reforms and changes and policies that she wanted to put into place. So I wore my Hillary t-shirt for the occasion. I also wore my Bernie cap, because I had been a Bernie Sanders supporter earlier. Old 1960s radical, you know, it's our generation. What's not to like about Bernie? So we settled in for the evening to celebrate. I had some wine. I ended up drinking a lot more of it than I had planned, because as the first returns began to come in, we were somewhat concerned, but we realized that this was early in the evening, things would change, and then as the later returns came in, we became more concerned, more problematic. I had been shooting off little notes to my students on Facebook and Twitter, and the comments became more and more seldom as the evening went on. And then it became apparent that Trump would actually have the possibility of winning. It just seemed so inconceivable. It was not just that his policies were bad, they were peculiar, odd, extreme, impossible, really. I mean, nobody's going to build a wall in Mexico, nobody's going to deport 11 million people. These things are simply foolish to never happen. It was not just that it was such a dismal kind of politics, but a dismal kind of person. I mean, he was, just as an individual, disreputable, a bad businessman, a fraud. He had cheated his own workers. He had cheated students who were in this fake university. He was a series of sexual assaults against women. He was an absolutely disgusting person, in addition to being an awful politician. How could he possibly win the selection of President of the United States? And it was not just that we saw Hillary as the better of two bad choices, the better of two evils. She seemed an absolutely appropriate person to carry out the unfinished business of the Obama legacy, to fulfill his unfinished agenda, and to be what we expected to be a very solid and promising president. So at the end of the evening, I didn't sleep well that night. I think the best way to describe it is like a death in the family. And it's not just someone who had a long, lingering illness that you expected to die. It was like someone in the fullness of life was hit suddenly by a truck and they disappeared. And in a case like that, it's not simply the absence that one grieves over, it's the promise, the potential, and everything that could have happened was denied. And to imagine this now was going to be the future that we had to deal with was a very difficult night for me personally. I did finally sleep, but not very long. I woke up early, around 6, and I began doing what academics always do when they're faced with a problem, and they start to write. start to write, and what I wanted to write was an answer to the question, why? Why was such a presidency even possible? There were many answers, of course, and some of them were peculiar to the American political situation at this particular time in history. And of the Rust Belt phenomenon of the states of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, which had been pivotal, always had been firmly Democrat in the past. They were supposed to be the firewall in this election. Clearly, the loss of jobs and the disappearance of the middle class, largely, of course, Republicans' responsibility from our point of view, but was certainly part of the issue. Part of the issue was the new form of political campaigning. The extraordinary use of social media, Facebook, Twitter, memes that were able to sway and convince an election. The extraordinary power of someone like Steve Bannon of Breitbart, who has launched a 3-year campaign to undermine the credibility of Hillary Clinton with seemingly foolish things like which email server she used. I mean, from my point of view, it's like, Yahoo or Gmail, who cares, what kind of server you use, it's what's on it, and there was obviously no evidence of any misdoing in that part. So there were these very specific issues, the fact that she did not generate the kind of support that Obama had, some 10% less Democrats voted in this election than previously. Not all the blacks came out in the same numbers, but more Chicanos did. And of course, as you know, she in fact did win the popular vote by this morning's count, by almost 2 million more votes. Just a remarkable number. Largely, of course, because of my state, California, and New York, overwhelmingly, some 70% of support went to Hillary over Trump. But this was not true in the middle part of the country. But these are all issues that were idiosyncratic to this particular moment of history in this particular location, the United States. In reading the New York Times report that morning of their survey of people who, exit polling, as people left the polls, what issues confronted them, I was struck by the fact that there were 3 predominant issues that concerned Trump voters. None had to do with walls or all of these peripheral things. The 3 issues were immigration, trade, international trade, and entangling foreign alliances. And I thought to myself, I've heard this before. I went back in the literature that interrogated the voters in the UK after Brexit, what were motivating them, and the issues were immigration, trade, and entangling foreign alliances. No surprise that some of the Brexit people were actually in Trump's campaign and were part of his advisors. And I said, this is interesting. This is not just an American phenomenon. This new kind of, in a sense, anti-globalism, a new kind of xenophobia, that raises fears about other people, whoever these others are defined as, is somehow coming in and changing this whole thing, our culture, our workforce, our identities, however the our is defined, is becoming a major trope, a major theme in an era of globalization. The economic fear that the economic elements of globalization are going to undercut and change and transform traditional economies, and have, of course, in ways that are destructive of the middle class. In the United States, the labor unions and the workforce of factories were what created the middle class and gave the extraordinary strength that then made the Democratic Party equally strong, because that was its base of support in the earlier decades of, later decades of the last century, but earlier decades of recent history. and fear of foreign entanglements. After all, it was Republicans, Bush, who brought America into two extraordinarily stupid wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Legacies then that Obama had to deal with in some way. More or less successful, but the rise of the persistence of the Taliban and the rise of ISIS created a whole new dilemmas with which he had to deal. But in America, tired of and befuddled about why we were involved in these wars in other parts of the world, saw a new kind of isolationism as the answer. And again, this was a feature of Brexit. This was a part of the surprising anti-globalism and the rise of an antipathy towards the UK relationship with the EU that made Brexit possible. And that makes so many other forms of a kind of strong men, and it's usually men, politics around the world possible in this particular era of late modernity and the rise of globalization. My colleagues in global studies, we've created a whole new field of study at my university at Santa Barbara, and now there are global studies programs all over the world. Interested and concerned with the rise of globalization, historically, but particularly at this moment in history. And many of them said, is globalization over? And my response is, anti-globalism is a form of globalization. I mean, it is the dark side of globalization. It's always been a part of the global phenomenon. And the rise of Trump in the United States, of Brexit in the UK, of Erdogan in Turkey, of al-Sisi in Egypt. You can decide whether Modi fits into this pattern or not. I'm not going to weigh in on that issue in front of this crowd. But, you know, I was in Japan a couple weeks ago, and they added Abe to the list. They did it, not me. My Chinese student said, well, look what Xi Jinping was doing in China. Maybe you should add him also to the list. We live in an era now, increasingly Putin mentioned Erdogan. We live in an era where kind of strong xenophobic nationalist forces seem to be the answer of the day. And for me, though, this has always been an aspect of the global phenomenon. I first became interested in global studies by studying just this sort of thing. It was back in the 1980s, and I'm somebody who's been interested in religion and politics all of my academic career. But in the 1980s, I disturbed to see the awful spiral of violence in the Punjab, young Sikh men in the Indian government. And this is of particular concern to me, not just as an academic, but as somebody who had lived in the Punjab for several years and taught at Punjab University. And these young students were people I knew. I mean, I didn't literally know them, but they could have been my students. And to see them caught up in this awful spiral of violence, it was a kind of ideology of resurgence of Sikh pride and identity and of cultural integrity. It was just incredible to see. And after 1984 and the disaster in the Golden Temple, the Operation Blue Star, and then the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and of course the death of Sant Janal Singh and Bindermali, when the movement was supposed to be destroyed, it actually gained force. And so I went back to the Punjab to try to understand why. This was the first major attempt that I made in trying to make sense out of what has become a part of an international pattern of the rise of religion and politics. And what I discovered was really quite striking. Because what I found in Bindermali was not what people said that I was going to find, the kind of usual media trope that politics is using religion, but because Bindermali all, he was not a political figure. He was a country preacher from Firozpur district, come to the Damdani Taxil, and was trying to instill in the predominantly young Sikh audience that he would speak in. I would going over his tapes and listening to his sermons, and we kind of look out over them and growl, and he'd say, you know, look at you, you've lost it. You're trimming your hair, and you're cutting your beard, and you're wearing shiny pants and fancy shoes, and you're hankering after government positions and university posts, and you've lost it. You've lost the spirit of your fathers and the gurus. There's a war going on. There's a battle between good and evil and right and wrong, and your job is to rise up, to take your sword and fight for your faith, to fight for your tradition. And I knew he didn't mean that just as a metaphor, although in every religious tradition there are these images of warfare or battle that can be appropriate for such reasons. But in his case, he meant that there was a real fight, a real struggle. And it was clear who the enemy was. It was not Muslims or other Hindus, although there were sometimes Hindus who targeted in the battle, but he would sputter when he talked. He didn't even want to say the name Indira Gandhi. He would say that woman born in the house of Brahmins. She's the one. She's the one trying to destroy our nation, our glory that is the Sikh culture. So it seemed to me that, in a funny kind of way, it was not so much a kind of political use of religion as it was a religious use of politics. It was seeing the political struggle within the grand template of religious drama, a religious scenario, a conflict between good and evil, right and wrong. And it was the secular state who was the enemy. Well, what a striking thing that this vision of the Enlightenment, of a nation state and a kind of ideology that was firmly and basically ethical. It was Rousseau who coined the term civil religion, that the idea that civil society has a kind of religiosity, almost Durkheimian sense of spirituality and morality that would will together a political community into a moral community. That vision from the Enlightenment would be seen as something corrupt, as something bereft of any kind of spiritual integrity, as something bereft of morality, something that needed to be replaced by a true politics, a spiritual politics. What an extraordinary critique. And what puzzled me even more was it was not idiosyncratic and peculiar just to the Sikhs of the Punjab. So this began a project that's now been going on for 30 years, where I've been looking at the rise of religious politics in different parts of the world. And much of it in the Middle East, but also in the United States, and also in the UK, and also in Japan, in places around the world where religion and politics have seemed to fit together in a kind of awful complicity against the secular state. And what appeared to me in the 1980s is simply a kind of anti-enlightenment rebellion. Seemed increasingly in the 1990s and then in the 21st century as an anti-global phenomenon. Because the ideology of secularism, the ideology of the kind of politics and the culture of a cultural-less, religion-less society is a trope that's followed and pursued by the agents of globalization. So we live in an era where the global world is seen by many of us, including those of us who enjoy it, who live in a multicultural world, who appreciate the kind of absence of any kind of a singular cultural identity, and who enjoy the multiplicity of cultural interactions. Seen by us as a very positive thing, but is seen by so many other people as a dangerous thing.
as something that's intrusive, something that's pernicious, something that's going to undermine and erode the values and the character of life that they cherish and which they hold dear. So, back to Trump. Is this phenomenon now, that it seems clearly to be at least one aspect of the recent American election, is this a sign of a new, beginning of a whole new kind of withdrawal from the global community? Is this a part of a global pattern of fear of globalization and fear of multicultural interaction? A fear of foreign entanglements and the easy mobility of populations from one place to the other around the world? Or is it simply a bump along the road? Is it simply, as my wife put it, kind of the last gasp of white European supremacism before it disappears from the face of the earth? I don't know. I don't know that answer. To me, it is an intrinsically part of a global phenomenon, but whether there is a healing component to it yet remains to be seen. I can tell you, however, in this particular case, in this particular election, that the sentiments of people who voted for Trump and who expressed these views also expressed a certain malleability in these views, a certain variety in the degree to which they felt that their fear of immigration should apply to all Muslims, for example, in the kind of stark way that Trump wants to put it, or all Mexicans in the way that implied by building the wall, or whether it was simply a kind of conditional response that could be challenged and redirected in some other ways. It may not be as stark as the polls would indicate. And in fact, in the 2 weeks since Trump has been elected, or at least selected by the Electoral College, even though Hillary Clinton received more of the popular vote than he did, his own position seemed to have radically changed. Now, one of the reasons why during the Republican primaries, my wife and I were really more optimistic about a Trump candidacy than, say, Ted Cruz, is that Ted Cruz believed in something. Trump didn't. He didn't really seem to believe in anything. So he would say things, and we assumed that he could change them just as quickly as he, announced these positions in the first place. And in fact, that's happened. So in the 2 weeks since the election, when it's come to that whole, the wall he was going to build between the United States and Mexico, he said, yes, he's going to build a wall over certain sections of the border. Well, there already is a wall over certain sections of the border. That's nothing new. And regarding, the immigration policies, no, maybe he's not going to send back all of the 11 million undocumented Mexicans who live in the United States, but just those who are guilty of crimes. That's already the policy in the United States. Obama's already been sending back, deporting far more than Bush, people who've been guilty of crimes who've been immigrants to the United States. Oh, and what about repealing Obamacare? It is, well, maybe you won't repeal all of it. You'll keep the good parts and just change the parts that need to be changed. That was Hillary's position during the campaign. She also wanted to correct those parts that needed to be changed. The news this morning is that he has been secretly meeting and having conversations with Obama in the last 2 weeks, getting his advice about what to do. Doesn't know. It's a very, very odd situation. He's just heard on the way coming in. He's only been at 2 CIA briefings since the election. There's supposed to be daily briefings that every president gets, and the president-elect also gets, and he's only been at 2 of them. There's just too much detail for him. He gets confused by them. So he's been sending Pence, his vice president, instead, which gives credibility to my own prognosis, actually one I gave before the election, that if he was elected, he probably wouldn't last more than a year or so. He would either be impeached by his own party, who never wanted him in the first place, or because he gets tired of it, because he never wanted to be president in the first place, and like Sarah Palin, he will resign in the middle of his presidency, and we'll have President Pence, whom I'm not sure would be better, because unlike Trump, Pence actually believes in stuff, and most of what he believes in is kind of awful, quite frankly, from my point of view. So at least the most extreme parts of the Trump position seems to be moderated. But that doesn't really change the underlying situation, which would have been the case even if Trump had lost, and because there would have been a sufficient amount of votes to have made the observation that I made at the outset still a valid one, that we live in an era where even the United States has joined with Britain and many other parts of the world in showing a fear of globalization and its impact economically, culturally, and politically. And whether this applies to India as well is something I'll be interested to hear your own observations about. But those are my initial comments, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have as a result. Thank you very much for being here.